It's terror time. Subscribe now and hit that like button so you don't miss any story. The most terrifying part of my personal hell is that it all started with a perfectly ordinary lunch. It was a rainy Sunday in Manchester, that damp cold that seeps into your bones, and the smell of Mrs. Higgins's Sunday roast, my landlady, wafted up the old building like an irresistible invitation. Me, Henry, with my mediocre life as an accountant, accepted the full plate she offered with a smile at her door. The roast was heavy, rich, the kind of food that comforts the soul and paralyzes your body on the sofa. I felt a particularly hard piece of the Yorkshire pudding between my teeth, something crunchy and strange that wouldn't dissolve. Tired, distracted, I swallowed without thinking. It was a simple, banal motion, a moment of pure carelessness that tore the fabric of my reality forever. In the days that followed, a strange sensation began to settle. It wasn't an illness, at least not one any doctor in Brighton, where I went to visit my parents, could diagnose. It was a cold weight in the pit of my stomach, an inert, icy presence that seemed to always be with me. The changes started subtly. The dreams first. I dreamed every night of a man with his back to me, in a wheat field somewhere in the Yorkshire Dales. He didn't turn, didn't speak, just whispered numbers, an endless, senseless sequence that echoed in my mind upon waking, in a cold sweat. The world around me began to take on a different texture. Colors seemed more faded, especially red, which now had a sickly, sepia tone. Sounds were distorted, voices became irritating buzzes, and I began to hear whispers in quiet places, like my tiny living room or the accounting firm where I worked. The entity, because I now knew it was an entity, did not communicate with words. It communicated with impulses. A sudden, overwhelming desire to count all the bricks on the building across the street, one by one, until my fingers bled. An irrational rage upon seeing a child with a strawberry ice cream. A fury so deep I had to lock myself in the bathroom to keep from screaming. The coin, I discovered what it was weeks later, in a moment of absolute desperation. The pain in my stomach had become a constant agony, an icy stabbing that doubled me over. Finally, after a night of violent vomiting where something metallic scraped my throat, I expelled it into the bathroom sink. It was a small old coin, made of a dark, heavy metal I didn't recognize. It didn't have the face of any emperor or important figure, just strange inscriptions, scratches that seemed to form patterns of eyes and twisted mouths. And it was warm, absurdly warm, as if it had come from a furnace, not from my stomach. Washing it under the cold tap was a mistake. The water evaporated upon touching the surface with a low hiss, and a voice, not a sound, but a pure form of alien thought, exploded inside my skull. It was a sensation of ancient possession, of an acquired right. The coin had been swallowed, the pact was made. I had not sought it, but it had found me. I was the house now, and the tenant had no intention of leaving. Right now, you over there must be thinking this is just a story, a tale to scare yourself before bed. You must be feeling safe, perhaps holding a warm cup of tea, the world around you stable and predictable. But I ask you, have you ever felt a chill for no reason in the supermarket? Have you ever heard a whisper where there should be no sound? Have you ever had a dark and sudden thought that didn't feel like your own? How can you be sure? How can you be so sure you didn't swallow your coin today at lunch? The fight became the only thing that defined my existence. I was a spectator inside my own flesh. My hands, once agile with a calculator, now shook constantly, not from nervousness, but from a repressive, malignant energy pulsing within me. The entity liked shadow and numbers. I spent hours locked in the office after hours, forced to realign all the files in a specific numerical order that only made sense to the thing inside me. If I resisted, the headache was so intense I saw spots of blood dancing in my vision. The bright office lights made me burn, literally. My skin turned red and irritated, so I wandered around my house in the dark, a zombie with a parasite in control. The worst part was the hunger. Not a hunger for food, but a hunger for something I dared not name. Smells began to affect me in a visceral way. The smell of iron, of raw blood, made my mouth water and a primitive, furious desire take hold of me. I started avoiding the butchers near the market, but one day, distracted, I walked past it. The smell hit me like a brick. My legs stopped working. I stood frozen on the pavement, drool running down my chin, my eyes fixed on the red meat exposed on the counter. My mind was a whirlwind of numbers, that sequence from my dreams, and of the smell, that wonderful and repugnant smell. I only managed to leave when a customer bumped into me, and the shock broke the spell for a second. I ran home, ashamed and terrified. The entity was growing, feeding on my sanity, on my resistance. It began to toy with me. Reflections in windows and mirrors no longer showed just my pale, baggy-eyed face. They showed, for a fraction of a second, something else. A wide smile full of sharp teeth where mine should be. Eyes completely black, no white, no soul. I avoided reflective surfaces like the plague. My house, once a modest refuge, became a labyrinth of frightening possibilities. Whispers came from the shower drain, scraping sounds from under the bed in the darkest hour of the night. I didn't sleep. I dozed in fits of exhaustion, only to be awakened by the sensation that something was sitting on my chest, watching, waiting. The coin. I had kept it in a metal box, buried at the back of a drawer. But it called to me. A low, constant pulsation, a magnet for my consciousness. I knew where it was all the time, as if it were an amputated part of my body that still itched. The desire to touch it, to hold it in the palm of my hand, was a sick craving the entity planted in me. It was its physical anchor in this world, and part of me, the part that was being assimilated, wanted to be near that source of dark power. The final straw was in Sheffield, during a business trip I couldn't cancel. In the cheap hotel, the room had a huge mirror opposite the bed. I was exhausted, on the verge of collapse. The entity was particularly agitated that night, perhaps because of the change of scenery. The pain in my stomach was an icy knife. I curled up on the bed, praying for sleep to come, but all that came was the voice. For the first time, it wasn't a whisper or an impulse. It was a clear word, resonating inside my skull like a funeral bell. Freedom. My own limbs moved on their own. I got out of bed, a puppet with invisible strings. I walked to the dresser and picked up the ballpoint pen from the hotel notepad. My hand, shaking violently but with a superhuman strength, began to tear the paper from the pad. They weren't words I was writing. They were those symbols, the same as on the coin, circles within circles, spirals that hurt the eyes, inscriptions that belonged to no human language. I was just the instrument, the vehicle. The entity was manifesting itself, using my hand, my strength, to express itself. The terror completely overwhelmed me. I had no control left. I was a passenger, witnessing the monster pilot steering the ship toward the rocks. I don't know how long I spent in that room, drawing those blasphemous symbols on every piece of paper I found, on the walls, on the sheet. I woke up on the floor, with the morning light creeping furtively through the window. My body ached as if I'd been beaten. All around me, the room was covered in my frantic drawings. The pen was still in my hand, the blue ink staining my fingers. The shame and horror were so profound I vomited right there. I left the hotel like a fugitive, leaving behind that monument to my madness. Now, I am back in my house in Manchester. I write this not as a plea for help, because I know there is no help possible. I write it as a warning, and perhaps as a way to keep what remains of Henry alive for a few more minutes. The coin is no longer in the box. It is in the pocket of my coat. I put it there. I need to feel it near. Its pulsation is a comforting mantra now, a heartbeat that is not my own, but has become familiar. The line between what I want and what it wants is dissolving like smoke. Soon, there will be no more Henry. There will only be the thing, the entity, and it will leave this house. It will need to feed, it will need a new house, a new host. It will look for someone distracted, someone hungry, someone like I was. And it will find them. It always finds them. Be careful what you eat. Be careful of the metallic taste where there should be none. It is always hungry, and the world is full of distracted people. The first time I saw one of the figures was the morning after the August full moon, a month after we moved to the farm on the outskirts of Dartmoor. I was only 9 years old, and what I saw that day never left me, just as the black earth of that place never left the dirt under my fingernails. My father, Arthur, inherited the property from a distant uncle, a lonely man the family seldom spoke of, and we, naive as we were, saw the opportunity as a blessing, an escape from the bustle of London. My mother, Eleanor, embraced the idea with an optimism that now sounds like a melody from another world, a world where such things do not happen. The property was large, isolated, surrounded by an endless sea of cornfields that whispered secrets with the wind. The house, an aged wooden structure, smelled of damp and loneliness. But it was on the first morning after that initial full moon that the true nature of the place revealed itself. I woke to silence, a heavy, unnatural silence that smothered even the birdsong. I came downstairs and found my father standing rigid at the living room window, his trembling hands on the sill. My mother was behind him, one hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror I didn't understand. Outside, scattered across the freshly turned earth at the edge of the cornfield, were them. 5 or 6 grotesque forms, made of twisted branches like bones, dry thorns, and a crust of black dirt that seemed grafted onto their structure. They weren't plants, they weren't animals. They resembled contorted humanoids, as if someone had tried to sculpt a person using only the debris of a dying forest. And every single one was facing our house. The empty spaces where I should have been were just darkness, but I felt the weight of their gaze, a fixed, hungry attention that made the air inside the room turn to ice. My father, a practical man who fixed everything with his own hands, did nothing. He didn't grab his shotgun, he didn't shout, he didn't go out to destroy those abominations. He just whispered, in a tone meant more for himself than for us, the harvest. He said the old uncle had spoken of it in a letter he dismissed as the ramblings of a lonely man. The bone harvest. Something, emerging from the cornfield under the full moon, planted ancient bones in the soil. And the next morning, those things sprouted. They would stand there, watching, until the moon waned, when they would collapse into a pile of sticks and earth. But if one of them, my father said in a rough voice that was not his own, reached the front door, the harvest would be complete. He didn't explain what that meant. The terror in his eyes was explanation enough. From that day on, our lives were governed by the phases of the moon. The month was divided between the agonizing relief of the waning and waxing moon, and the absolute terror of the full. My parents aged 10 years in that first year. The farm, which was meant to be our livelihood, withered. The cornfield was the temple of that thing, and my father no longer had the courage to venture into it beyond what was strictly necessary. The fence separating the yard from the crop was reinforced with barbed wire and wood, a flimsy barrier that gave us an illusion of safety. Every full moon was a ritual of horror. We locked every door and window, extinguished every light, and gathered in the central hallway of the house, the room farthest from the windows. We would listen, in the absolute quiet of the night, to the sound of something moving in the cornfield. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, slow, methodical dragging, as if something immensely heavy and ancient was hauling itself across the earth, performing its macabre work. The air grew thick with the smell of damp soil and century-old bones. No one slept. No one breathed properly. And the next morning, there was always one more. Or one was several inches closer than it was the previous full moon. I grew up under this constant siege. My younger sister, Amelia, who was just a baby during our first full moon, never knew another reality. Her childhood drawings didn't have suns or flowers. They had dark figures of sticks and circles representing the full moon. Her innocence was pruned by that curse, just as my parents' hope was slowly replaced by a silent, frightening resignation. And then came the worst part. Gradually, we began to recognize features in the figures. One of them, shorter, recalled the height and posture of my late grandfather. Another had a protrusion on its main branch that bore a grotesque resemblance to the way my uncle, the previous owner, carried his shoulder. It was as if the earth and thorns were trying to imitate, in a crude and horrifying way, those who had lived on this land before, or perhaps those who were destined to join the harvest. Right now, you might be listening to this, comfortable where you are, and thinking it's just a story. That there's a logical explanation, perhaps a cruel neighbor, a collective madness induced by isolation. I have wished so desperately to believe that. But I challenge you to sit in the dark, in total silence, and listen. Listen to your own house. Listen to the wind outside. And if the wind stops and is replaced by a low sound of earth being turned, of something heavy dragging itself toward your window, you will understand. The fear I feel isn't a monster under the bed. It's the certainty that the universe is indifferent and that there are places where the rules are different, where the earth is hungry and has teeth made of bone and thorn. Last night was the worst of all. The full moon was particularly bright, illuminating the yard with a ghastly silver light. The sound in the cornfield wasn't a drag. It was footsteps, heavy, deliberate. And this time, it didn't stop at the field's edge. We heard the barbed wire fence strain to its limit and snap with a dry crack that echoed like a gunshot in the silent night. My father cried. It was the most horrible sound I have ever heard. This morning, at dawn, we looked out from the attic window. All the figures were there, a silent army of twigs and dirt. But they weren't standing at the field's border. They were lined up in our yard, just a few meters from the house. And one of them, the one that looked like my grandfather, had one arm stretched out forward, as if it had taken the last possible step before the daylight froze it in place. It is closer than any other has been before. The wind has changed, and I can smell them even inside the house, an odor of an open grave and something sweetly rotten. Night is falling again. The moon is already visible in the sky, a pale, sickly stain against the darkening blue. My father is in the living room, holding his shotgun with hands that won't stop shaking, but we know bullets don't work against earth and memory. My mother is hugging Amelia, humming an old lullaby, a futile attempt to muffle the sound that will certainly come. And I am here writing this. There is no one to ask for help. No one would come out here, even if they believed. And perhaps that is the most terrifying thing, knowing that when night falls, those footsteps will start again. And this time, the fence is already broken. And that figure, the one that looks like grandfather, has its arms stretched toward our door. I don't know what happens when the harvest is complete. I only know that the silence that will follow the footsteps will be infinitely worse than any sound. It is a silence that already consumes this house, that already lives inside us. It is the silence of the earth after it has been fed. The old barn on my grandfather's farm wasn't haunted by ghosts, but by time. And that was infinitely worse. It all started with the dogs, or rather, their absolute refusal to go near that heap of rotten wood and broken tiles. They didn't growl, they didn't bark. They just cowered and ran with their tails between their legs, a reaction of pure, instinctual terror that should have been our first warning. My name is Thomas, and I spent my summers on that farm in Devon, a place that smelled of damp earth and the past. My grandfather, Albert, a man as dry and wrinkled as an old fig, always warned us, me and my cousins, to keep away from the old barn. Not because of rusty tools or unstable wood, but because, according to him, the place had a sickness in time. The true nature of that sickness was revealed to me one hot July afternoon when I was 12. A deflated football, my only companion on those days, rolled toward the barn and stopped right at the edge of its shadow. Grandad Albert's rule was absolute, but the prospect of being without the ball all summer was a greater risk than disobedience. I walked over, my skin prickling with an apprehension I didn't understand. The air around the barn was strangely still, heavy, as if trapped in thick glass. The sound of the geese on the distant pond and the buzz of the cicadas simply vanished when I took the final step to retrieve the ball. As I straightened up, I looked inside the barn through a gap in the planks. It wasn't dark inside. Instead, it was bathed in a dusty, golden late afternoon light, but an afternoon from decades past. A man who wasn't my grandfather, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, had his back to me, humming a low, tuneless melody. He was sharpening a scythe on a grindstone. The sound, a rhythmic, metallic scrape, was the only thing I could hear, so sharp and close it seemed to be inside my own head. Then, a young woman in a floral dress came into my limited view, her face pale with the expression of silent fear. She said something. Her words were muffled whispers, like a poorly tuned radio. The man turned. I didn't see his features, just the scythe rising in a silver arc. And then the scream. It wasn't a loud scream, it was a choked, hoarse sound, cut off so abruptly my brain refused to process it. And then it all repeated. Exactly the same. The man humming, the scythe scraping on the stone, the woman entering, the whisper, the silver arc, the cut-off scream. It was a loop, a record stuck on the last 60 seconds of that woman's life. I didn't scream, I didn't run. I was paralyzed, my blood turned to ice, my lungs refusing to work. The scene repeated 3 more times, each loop more terrifying than the last. An eternity of that horrible moment trapped in a fragment of time. When I finally managed to break free, I fell backwards, my convulsing fingers grabbing the deflated ball. I crawled away from there, and the sound of the world, the geese, the cicadas, returned suddenly, strident and vulgar in their normality. I never told anyone what I saw. Who would believe a boy? Years passed, I grew up, I became a skeptical adult, but I could never erase the memory of that scene from my mind. It became a mental scar, a memory that visited my nightmares with cruel fidelity. The farm was inherited by my mother, Elizabeth, and after Grandad Albert's death, she decided to sell it. It fell to me, the eldest son, to do the final clearing out. And that meant confronting the barn one last time. Now, you listening to me, comfortable in your chair, with a solid and predictable world around you, you might think this is just a story. You might think a boy's memory is a fragile thing, prone to exaggeration. But I challenge you to close your eyes for a second and imagine. Imagine a place where the most basic rules of your universe, the orderly sequence of cause and effect, simply do not apply. A place where the past isn't dead, but trapped, agonizing in a moment of infinite horror. How can you be sure such a place doesn't exist, hidden in plain sight, waiting only for someone to take the wrong step? As I approached the barn on that overcast morning, an adult and supposedly rational, the same feeling of oppression enveloped me. The air was heavy and silent. This time, the door was slightly ajar, not as an invitation, but because that place sensed my intention, my need to close this chapter. I needed to go in. I needed to prove to myself it was just an old barn, that a frightened boy's memory had created that terrible fantasy. I pushed the heavy door, which moved with a muffled sound, as if the air itself resisted. The interior didn't smell of mold or dead animals, but of something indefinable, metallic and dry, like the smell of lightning about to strike. The light coming through the cracks didn't illuminate properly, creating pools of dense darkness that seemed solid. I took a step inside, and it was like diving into an icy lake. The pressure changed. My ears popped. The barn wasn't large, but at that moment it seemed to stretch forever in every direction, the walls receding into infinite gloom. And then I saw her. The woman in the floral dress. She wasn't a translucent apparition. She was solid, real, standing a few meters from me, her back turned. The man was nowhere I could see. She turned slowly. Her eyes were voids of pure terror, and she stretched out a hand toward me, not for help, but as a warning. Her lips moved, and for the first time, I heard the word, clear and terrified, "Run." But it was too late. I felt a sudden weakness in my legs, a deep ache in all my bones. I looked at my hands holding the flashlight. The skin over my knuckles seemed thinner, more translucent, the veins darker and more prominent. The nails were yellowed and brittle. A sharp pain throbbed in my knee, an arthritis I'd never had. The time inside the barn wasn't showing me the past, it was accelerating me toward my future. Every second inside that temporal prison was a day, a week, a month of aging. Youth was being drained from me, my life force evaporating like water under a relentless sun. The woman from the loop was still there, her moment of horror repeating silently in a corner. But now I had my own temporal tragedy to face. I tried to run toward the door, but my movements were slow, heavy, those of a much older man. My lungs wheezed, my vision blurred. I fell to my knees in the dry straw, which now smelled of bone dust. The door seemed so distant, a rectangle of mundane light that grew smaller with each beat of my tired heart. I wasn't trapped in the past, I was being rapidly erased into the future, becoming a ghost of myself before I was even dead. And the worst part was knowing that woman, in her eternity of agony, had tried to warn me. She, who lived the worst moment of her life repeatedly, had more compassion for me than the universe itself. The barn isn't haunted, it is a wound, and I, like a fool, had dived right into it. Now, time is my only cell, and every breath is that of a man closer to his grave.